Hello my friends, and a very warm welcome back to my painting channel. And in today's video I'm going to be painting Gandalf the Grey from the Games Workshop Fellowship of the Ring box set. So this is part 3 of the Fellowship of the Ring, and you're more than welcome to join along and paint with me, or if you want you could just chill out and watch me paint and join in at a later stage. So we're going to start off as always with the skin, and I'm using the same sort of technique that I've used with the previous members of the Fellowship of the Ring. So we're starting with one of my more common and more well used techniques for painting skin. As I've said previously, this is a very tried and tested, quick and simple way of painting skin that does deliver some really great results. So I'm starting with a bellow beige red, and then I'm adding a small amount of Raglan flesh shade, just so that this picks out a few of the details, and this will dry down into all of the cracks and creases in between the fingers and the eye sockets and the mouth and things like that. And then we'll build this back up as we go. So just going to put this across all of the skin area, and then we're just going to wait for that to dry down before we move on to painting this back up. So once the shade is dried, and it's completely dried, then we're going to go back to the base colour that we used, and we're going to use that beige red once again. Now with Gandalf, he does have quite a small face, and it can be quite difficult to get to, especially when you're trying to paint between his quite heavy wide-brimmed hat and his staff as well. So just take your time, use the very tip of the brush as much as you possibly can to get into those little tiny sort of areas, and just build up around those eyes and things like that. Once you've done that, then just as a step up, we're going to use the beige red with a basic skin tone. And for this one, I'm mixing these paints by half and half, so about 50-50 in terms of the split, just so that the paint is nice and smooth, so that this becomes sort of like a half step up, and this allows the colour and contrast to boost. You can go a little bit further than that and paint just the basic skin tone again on top if you want, but because with Gandalf his skin is under a lot of the hat and things like that, I found that with just a single step up was perfect, and that was quite enough. So from there we're going to paint the rest of the colours. So we're going to put all of the base colours on now. And the good thing with Gandalf is he's predominantly a mostly painted grey. So we're going to stick with a very simple dark colour to begin with, and then build up from there. So I'm going to use a Vallejo dark blue grey, and this is a great base colour to start with, because this does almost have a really sort of like dark slate colour to it. And then once we wash this down and build it back up, it's going to create a really nice effect. Now the cool thing with Gandalf as well is because he has a few little bits that are different, so things like his staff and his sword and the beard, we're going to paint those slightly different colours, so that then, because the majority of the model is this one dark grey, all of those other colours are really going to stand out and look amazing. They're really going to pop off the miniature, and they're going to draw your eye to little focus points across the miniature as well. So I'm starting by just using dark rust on his staff, which is a really nice dark brown base coat. Again, this is one of my favourite colours, so if you've watched some of my other videos, you'll know that I paint and use this paint quite a lot for brown bases, and I build up from there. Just be careful not to get any of the paint on the skin that you've already painted, and take your time as much as you can, and of course use nice thin down paints as well. So once I've done that, I'm also then just going to paint black across all of the areas that I'm going to paint a little bit later. So I'm going to cover the leather straps with this black, and I'm also going to cover the sword and any metal parts like the little rings just across the belt buckles and things like that. And I'm going to paint a different kind of I'm going to paint, spend a little bit more time sort of explaining the sort of non-metallic metal sort of effect that I painted on Sam, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on that later, so I'll show you kind of how I've done that a little bit later. So just being careful to put the black on, and once that's done, then I'm just popping a little bit of white just across the top for the crystal, and you can use sort of like an off-white or a dead white or anything like that that might be a little bit different to being too over-the-top white as well, and that would be great. So once we've done that, we're just going to move on and cover the beard. So we're just going to paint this with a Stonewall Grey. Now Stonewall Grey is a really good mid-tone, light sort of middle grey. This is good because this will allow us to separate that beard from the cloak and the hat and things like that. So as I said, the beard will stand out, and it will give us a little bit of something to look at with all of that grey being on the model. So once all of those base coats are done, I'm just going to use a quick shade of Citadel's Null Oil, and I'm going to cover the whole miniature with this except for the skin area, because the skin we've already painted, we don't need to shade that down anymore. So I'm just going to cover the whole miniature, being as careful as possible not to get this onto the skin. Especially around things like the hands. On something like the staff, it's easy to put too much on top and then it'll dribble down onto the hand, so just be careful of it pooling around the hand on the staff and things like that. So that's all of the base coats and all of the skin and everything done. Now from there we're going to build everything back up. So we're going to start with the beard. Now if you want you can dry brush this, however dry brushing you don't kind of have the same control that you would if you sat down and really sort of spent the time painting. So for this what I'm going to do is just use the very tip of one of my fine detail brushes. I'm just going to try and pick out as much of the hair as possible like this. And the good thing by doing this instead of dry brushing, you're not getting any of that colour and any of that dry brush on anything else like the skin or the dark grey that we've spent so long painting. So you just build in those tones up and just being very, very careful. You can see how I'm just trying to select all of those little points where the hair is, and I'm just trying to paint across the most raised areas like so, and I'm just painting across, just creating a few little sort of like sort of strands of hair and things on some of the flatter areas as well. So once we've done that part, I'm going to move back onto that dark blue grey. Now because the Null Oil is a black wash, this is going to shade and bring the colour and the tone of this dark blue grey down quite a lot. And that's really good because when we start to build this back up in nice thin coats, as you can see I'm painting this nice and thin, what we're going to do is we're just going to follow the straight sort of, the fluid sort of lines of the cloak, and we're just going to build this as we did with the beard, just on the top areas. So we're going to try and keep the black and leave that black wash dried out in the recessed areas. So as you can see I'm painting the folds of the clothes, but I'm just kind of avoiding where that black has dried. Just like so. So on the front you can see there's a few creases here just where the belt, the leather of the belt is just holding the cloak together. So as you can see I'm just building this up in very, very thin layers and in thin textures. And the cool thing is, as I said, by following the movement and the fluid movement of the cloak, that's going to add to the movement and the dynamism of the model as well. And I'm not overly worried about leaving sort of brush strokes and things as well, because personally when I paint certain things like cloth and cloaks like this, it does add to that illusion that there are more creases and there is a little bit more texture to the cloak and to the clothing and things like that as well. And that's kind of what you want when you're painting clothes. You don't want it to be too over the top, or you don't want it to be too flat and things like that. So by using sort of those brush strokes I tend to build up a little bit more texture and things like that. And I'm just doing the same thing around the hat as well. As you can see I'm just leaving a few sort of brush strokes, just kind of building the element that there's a few sort of folds and things like that through the paint, see? So what I'm doing is I'm using that dark blue grey, and I'm using a very, very small amount of white. Now the reason why I've said a very, very small amount of white is because with grey, especially something like this dark blue grey, if you add too much white, it can change the property of that grey and make it really, really, really bright. So what I would suggest is I'm probably using only about 10% white, so a very, very small drop of white. So what I would suggest to do is just put a very, very small amount of white on your palette and just mix that gently into that that dark blue grey until you see it just create a slight highlight. So nothing too fancy, nothing too over the top. You want to try and create this so that it blends nicely and it looks natural, so that this isn't too extreme of a jump up. And again, because the paint is nice and thin, as you can see, this is taken to the model quite nicely, and it doesn't look too out of place, it doesn't look too extreme or too over the top, and this is going to dry nicely into the model and into the into the sort of painting style that we're doing. Now the good thing by using these very, very thin layers as well is it's almost like glazing. So what that means is you can go over those areas a few different times, and that means you're building the vibrancy up. So when your paint is nice and thin, it doesn't stick to the miniature too much, which allows you to build the vibrancy through multiple layers. And the good thing with that is, as you're progressing up the model, then you can only you can pick more specific areas for the paint to sit. So say if you paint sort of all of the way down on the first layer, you could paint 3/4 of the way down on the second layer, halfway down on the third. So that's building the vibrancy from the top down and things like that. So now that I've used the first layer of that dark blue grey with white, I've just added a very, very small amount again. So again, like I said, just going up in increments, just going up in very small stops. And again, because the paint is very thin, it's not going to look too over the top. It's not going to look too overdone. So you can see just how thin the paint is, that in some ways, it almost looks like I'm not painting much onto the miniature with this layer. And that's great, because this glaze level now, and this glaze stage, so this thin layer that we're painting up, this is where the vibrancy is going to boost. And as you can see, I'm trying my best not to go too far down the miniature. So as I said about building up in increments, so going from all of the way down, then just to halfway, just trying to pick out where maybe some of the light points might be sitting, and again just building that vibrancy and boosting that vibrancy in stages. Again, I'm sticking to using those very straight structured sort of brush strokes, following the folds of the cloak, following the way the cloak is moving, and following the flow of the cloak as well, so that again that adds to the character, that adds to the movement and the motion and the dynamism of that miniature as well. It does take a little bit of practice to get these sort of step ups with the white to the point that you like them, but the good thing is, if the paint is nice and thin, it is a little bit more forgiving, because if it does dry down, you can, like I say, add more layers. So what you kind of want to do is make it so that you can add more layers to it. So you want to be quite gentle and add layers to build the vibrancy, instead of going too extreme right at the beginning and then feeling like it's stepped up too much. So going back to the beard, now that we've done all of the greys on the cloak, we're just using that Stonewall grey again, but I'm mixing in a small amount of sky grey for this one. And sky grey is a much lighter colour than the Stonewall grey, so I'm using a 50-50, so half and half like I said before, and that's purely just to build a little bit of a highlight, and then I'm being a little bit more fussy about where I place that. And once that's done, just going on to the leathers. So if you followed some of the other Fellowship of the Ring paintings that I've done, I'm just using the same sort of leather effect that I used with all of those, just so that it ties all of those paintings and ties all of those models together. So I'm starting with a leather brown colour from AK Interactive, and this takes on top of that black really, really nicely, and it's a good, perfect first starting colour as to where we can go. And there we go. Once we painted the leather brown, we're just going to move on and mix half and half of the leather brown and deep brown together. And the deep brown is one of the vibrant ranges of the AK Interactive, so this does boost that colour quite a lot. And we're going to be really sort of scratchy and really uneven with this one. Again, just using the very tip of the brush, and as you can see, I'm using sort of like a stippling motion and a dabbing motion, so just kind of creating a little bit of a scratchy kind of effect out of the leathers, rather than keeping them all looking too neat and too nice. So once that layer is dried as well, I'm just going to move on to the deep brown on its own. As I said, this is a very vibrant colour, so this does boost a lot of the leather. So this time we're getting a little bit more scratchy and a little bit more selective just across the very edges, just kind of creating a little bit more sort of depth and a little bit more sort of like roughness and raggedness to the way that those leathers have been worn down over time. There we go, just being as careful as we can. And again, just trying not to hit so where those sort of like belt buckles or those little metal rings that are holding the belts together are. As you can see, that's built the vibrance and built the leathers up quite nicely straight through, as quick and as easy as that. So we're just going to move on to doing the staff, and the staff is quite an easy one as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to mix dark rust and flat earth together. And again, I'm going half and half with this, so 50% of each paint, so 50-50. And I've watered this one down again quite nicely to make a nice thin paint. So this is just going to paint just across the top, and I'm trying to leave some of the gaps and things, especially across the top where the staff sort of breaks open into a few different branches. So I'm being a little bit more selective across the top as to where this paint is going to be. And then once that's dried down, as you've guessed, you've seen the way that I paint, so we're just going to move on and use the flat earth on its own. And now I'm going to be very, very selective as well, so using a much more thin down detail brush and a nice thin paint as well. And we're going to build the staff look from the top, just like so, where the light is catching, and just build this down and drag this down. And the cool thing with this is, if we are quite selective in our lines with the way that we're painting this down as well, we're going to leave some of that colour underneath, which is going to create the element of like those sort of gaps and those little bits in sort of like the textures and things that you get out of the wood as well, which is great. That's exactly what we're looking for. We don't want the colours to be too flat, and this is a quick and easy way of getting that kind of effect. So this time now with the earth, the flat earth, I'm not going to paint sort of all of the way down of the staff. As you can see, I'm only picking little bits. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make the staff lighter across the top and darker across the bottom. So I'm going to use a beige brown then for another highlight. And again, I'm being more selective again with the staff, and especially across those sort of branchy parts across the top. Now for this layer, I'm only painting the top half of the staff, so that this doesn't brighten up the bottom too much, so that this creates the illusion and the effect that the staff is brighter at the top and darker at the bottom, which is kind of what you want, being as the light kind of comes out of that crystal across the top of Gandalf's staff just there as well. So yeah, just being as selective as possible across the top parts here, and trying to build up the sort of textures and things through those branchy parts. And then we're going again just for one more highlight, and I mean this is an optional highlight, so this is just a mixture of beige brown and bone white added together. And again, as I said, to make all of my mixtures as easy as possible, I'm trying to mix this one just sort of like half and half again, just so this becomes like a single stop up in terms of its vibrancy and things like that. And again, I'm being quite scratchy, and I'm also being very selective as to where I'm catching the sort of branchy parts and the wooden parts of the staff as well, just to create again that illusion of lighter points and a little bit of an illusion as to like the wooden effects and the feel of the wood to it as well. You see that I'm not catching all of the staff. So that's all of the basic sort of parts to Gandalf done. I mean, you can paint sort of the metals in a normal metal. I'm going to use these colours here, so silver grey, graphite, anthracite grey and ocean blue, and we're going to try and build this into a sort of non-metallic metal kind of effect. So similar to what we did with Sam, I'm going to spend a little bit more time sort of explaining. Now, just going to show you quickly what I mean by thinning those paints down. You should see just how thin this paint is. So as you can see, it runs a lot more like water. You can see just how thin this is. And then when I use the very tip of the brush, you see how this isn't, the coverage is much thinner and much smoother. And I'm going to use two brushes for this, or at least I'm going to start to use two brushes from this, but one of my brushes didn't want to play ball. And the reason for this is I'm using a thin, as you can see, very thin layer first of the anthracite grey, which is a dark blue grey. And what I'm doing is I'm just putting this into small areas on the miniature. So instead of painting this and covering the whole of the sword and things like that, as you can see, I'm just painting up a little bit and then leaving little gaps and things like that, so that this creates sort of like a darker point and then a lighter point. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to blend this through. So with the second brush, as you can see, the second brush is damp, which means it's not wet. So what I've done is I've wet the brush and then sort of taken the excess water off, and then using that damp brush, just mixing and blending the colour back through. And by doing that, what we're going to do is we're going to have really thin textures in between sort of the chunks and the areas where the paint is. And that's going to allow us to blend these colours through, creating a really cool sort of like magical, non-metallic metal kind of effect out of the base. Now you can do this with all different kinds of colours, all different kinds of greys and blues, and you can add different warmer tones if you've got sort of lighting in areas of your miniature, so if like one of them's holding a lantern and things like that. But I'm just showing you on here with this particular technique just to give you an idea as to how I'm blending the sword through. So yeah, you can see just how thin down the paint is. We're moving on to using the graphite colour now from that set that I showed you. And you can see how thin the paint was originally when I placed it on the model. And then using that damp brush, you can see just how much I'm sort of blending this tone through. As you can see, starting to show like a highlight just across certain areas there, just like so. So you can see that it's becoming highlighted in certain patches. And as you see, now we're just going to blend that through again. So kind of keeping the darker area in the middle of this one, and then across the bottom and top of the bottom half. And this is great because this is going to blend down, and this is going to dry down, where this is going to give you areas that are dark, areas that are light. But because we're thinning that paint and we're blending that paint through quite a lot, this is going to create really, really nice, smooth blended textures as well. So just be careful not to use too much water. Like I said, just try to keep that brush damp rather than wet, and you can manipulate and drag that colour through. So I'm just using a little bit of the ocean blue out of that set, and I'm just adding a little bit of blue tone into this. You don't have to use, like I say, the same sort of colours, but because with this particular model and the set itself is in a really grey dark setting in Balin's tomb, when I'm painting these, I'm painting with these like blues and greys and graphite colours. And the reason for that is because there's no real sort of light source that's like picking up on the like the yellows or the warmer tones or anything like that. So I'm trying to keep everything toned down, quite grey, quite blue, trying to keep it a little bit moody and things like that, so that it will all suit and match the set that I've made for it. And then again, as you can see, just building up another layer of that graphite layer there. And as you can see, I'm just blending those tones back through so that we're not having chunks of colour and things like that. It's just going to blend through and dry through really, really nicely. Now as I'm building that colour up, the grey, so I'm going through the graphite, I'm also mixing in some of the silver grey as well, because the silver grey then is also going to create sort of a highlighting boost as well. And again, we're just adding it in areas, so as you can see, just adding a little bit across one part of the sword, a little bit just across the bottom, a little bit just across the top. And then again, look, we're just going to drag that colour back through, and that's going to create a nice even, nice smooth blend between that light and dark, as we were saying earlier. And this is a really cool technique. You can use this with all sorts of different colours, and you can create some really, really cool, nice, easy blends by doing this. And the good thing is, because you're using such thin, such fine layers, you can put quite a lot of different layers onto the miniature, and it's not going to take over or control that the weapon or anything like that. You're not going to lose detail. You're not using thick layers that are going to lose out on any of the detail or anything like that. You're actually blending this through nice and smoothly. So this is the silver grey layer that I was talking about. So this is the highlighted layer, and as you can see, those colours and those tones, the highlighting layer is starting to show through. We're starting to get some really, really nice highlights across the top, and it's cool if it doesn't it's cool if we don't use too many highlights on the underneath area here, because we kind of want the bottom part of the sword to be darker than the top part of the sword, just so that gives you an idea that the light is catching the top more than the bottom and things like that. So there we go. Once our blends and our sword is blended together really, really nicely, as you can see, those smooth layers between the light and dark are starting to look really, really great. So what we're going to do is we're going to be very, very selective and just using the white colour, so just using a really nice vibrant white colour, which is going to be really, really selective as to where we place this. And what we're going to do is we're going to pick out some of the really fine details, so just across the edge of the sword, just down the middle of the sword as well. We're not going to run this as a smooth, perfect line. I'm going to dab this and dot this so that this looks a little bit like there's chips in the sword and it's a little bit worn. And then just to add that character as well, I'm going to add some really fine lines. And you don't have to be as uniformed with this. You can be quite random. You know, the lines you can make sort of in different patterns, because these are supposed to be like scratches and bits where the sword has been worn down and things. So that's not going to be too uniformed anyway. As you use items in real life, they kind of get scratched and broken and worn down in so many different ways, but this is just how I like to paint, so you don't have to follow it exact, but it's a cool way of doing things. And all in all, once it's done, your Gandalf should look something like this. So we've got this really cool, really dark sort of grey colour to those robes that's starting to boost in the light. We've got this great difference in colour between the leather belts, the staff, and the sword then as well. It's starting to look pretty awesome. It's kind of got that two-tone where it's brighter on top and darker down the bottom. And I've also added a really cool photo where I've put Gandalf holding the staff with the light as well. So, as always, my friends, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for your comments, thank you for your support. I really do appreciate all of the time and effort that you guys give me. And hopefully you enjoyed this video, and I will see you on the next one.